get going. So I'm Amber with Farming Forward. I'm the Extension and Communications Coordinator. You'll also see Carrie St. Pierre here with Farming Forward. She's our Executive Director. And then you'll also see Leanne in our group here. She's also from Farming Forward. Research Coordinator. I'm sorry, Leanne. Um, but yeah, I appreciate you guys all being here tonight. And I appreciate everybody who's done the poll so far. If everybody could just make sure we mute ourselves so that we don't have any background noise because this webinar is being recorded. And yeah, I'll hand it over to Sharon for her introduction about Ladue County. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, hi. Yes, as Amber said, I'm from Leduc County. My name is Sharon Fay, and I'm the local food coordinator there. And we always enjoy working with Farming Forward on events such as this. And we certainly get a much wider spread that way, and it's great to see people from all over the province. So, before I introduce the speaker, I'll give you a little bit of a heads up as to what to expect tonight. We'll have about an hour of presentation, thereabouts. And then the last 25 minutes, which would be like just after 8 to 8:30, we'll take your questions. So as we go along, please put your questions in the chat and we'll keep track of them and then ask them at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to pull up my slides here in a moment. Okay, you should be able to see that. All right, so we're working with a number of partners, and this has been a series of 3 types of livestock. So this is our last of the series of 3. And we are privileged to work with these partners, and it includes the livestock associations in the province and beyond. So we've got Alberta Goat Association, Alberta Lamb Producers, and Alpaca Livestock Producers and Cooperators Association, as well as support from Ardar and Saskatchewan Agriculture. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. So our speaker is Peyton Eit from, she'll be presenting on Alpacas 101. And Peyton is a second generation alpaca breeder based out of the Yellowhead County, where her family continues to raise alpacas. She is an active supporter of the Canadian alpaca community, where she presently holds director positions with the Alpaca Livestock Producer Cooperators Association, also known as Alpaca, which represents alpaca producers within Alberta. Also, she's a part of the Canadian Llama and Alpaca Association, which maintains the National Llama Herd Book. And she is the current president of Alpaca Canada, the national association which represents alpaca producers across the country. So through her work, Peyton is passionate about supporting producers' efforts to connect with and to educate the public on the alpaca industry, husbandry, and fiber. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Peyton.
Thank you, Sharon. 1 second here, and I will share my slides. Mm-hmm. And we're gonna hope this cooperates this time. Okay, it looks correct on my screen. Can you see it okay on yours? Perfect. Okay, so thank you again for the introduction. I look forward to talking with all you guys tonight. We're just going to go over kind of a basic overview of raising alpacas and what that can look like in Alberta. So I try to keep it pretty broad. You're going to find there's probably not as many pictures in the slideshow as maybe I would have preferred, but there's a lot of information I'd like to share with you guys. And of course, we'll have space for those questions at the end. So yeah, like Sharon said, a little bit about myself. I am currently the president of Alpaca, so the provincial club in Alpaca Canada, and I am a director on the CLAA. I'm doing this presentation on my own. I'm not actually doing it, like this isn't on behalf of any of these associations, it's in cooperation with Alpaca, but I have received no funding from any of these associations to be putting this on. I will be mentioning a little bit more about them later on, just because they're great resources for farmers, but they are in no way providing any sort of funding for this. So what we're probably going to end up talking about today, obviously a little bit about what alpacas actually are. There's a little bit of confusion sometimes about them versus llamas. Get into a little bit about the history of alpacas, especially as we've seen them in Canada. And then we're going to get into a little bit of the husbandry, how we raise them, why we raise them, what might get into like our preferences for picking the animals that we might want to start off with, or maybe want to add to our herds. A little bit about the communities that you can access and the resources available in those communities. And then also common problems that we do sometimes see, or at least most commonly what we have reported to us as experienced breeders when we're mentoring people. There's going to be a little bit of variation. So I'm speaking largely from my experience in that regard. But I mean, we get a lot of questions that come through to us through Alpaca that sometimes, you know, some come up more often than others. So to start things off with, what are alpacas? So yeah, when we're thinking about alpacas and llamas, they are related, they are cousins. So alpacas are the smaller cousin, and they both actually are camelids, but they were domesticated from two different side species. So alpacas are domesticated from vicuña, whereas llamas were domesticated from guanacos. There are two very different size differences there, and also purposes for those domestications. So what we see is alpacas, they're domesticated primarily for their fiber. They're also used for meat. Because vicuña are smaller, alpacas also are smaller. So you're going to see the average alpaca is going to sit between 100 and 200 pounds. They're not going to be much taller than 32 to 39 inches at the shoulder. We also see differences in terms of their head shape, differences in terms of how their body is built. So we're going to see more of a compact body and more of that kind of that round, fluffy appearance in just those shapes and those angulations that people have come to associate with kind of like the cute version of these animals. There are also two coat types. We don't have breeds with alpacas, we have coat types. So we have Wakayas, which are the teddy bear fluffy looking ones, and Surrey, which have long flowing locks. Another important element with alpacas is they are non-shedding. There's sometimes a little bit of confusion there because there are types of llamas that do shed. So when we're looking at llamas, like I said before, they are domesticated from guanacos. They are significantly larger. So a small llama is going to be in the 250-pound range. A large llama can get up to 500 pounds. You're going to be seeing animals that are going to be between 40 and 57 inches tall at the shoulder. They are definitely tall enough that it can be hard to get a halter on them if you are short, like myself. So, you know, there are some notable differences when you're walking up to some of these animals in the pasture. Now, the size is necessary for llamas because they were domesticated with the purpose of being draft animals. They're used for packing. They're also used for meat. And so you're going to see some differences in terms of structure. They tend to be a little bit blockier in structure. You see more of a straight top line. You also see a little bit more of that focus on animals, especially for like the working lines, being able to hold a pack without those packs kind of being an issue. You're not going to see animals sitting there with really heavy fleeces that they might overheat with. So there are a lot of other types of llamas depending on their purpose. More modern llamas, there are some focuses on developing fibers. You're going to see more of that with the single and the double coats, the Surrey llamas for sure, and Argentine llamas. Now the working llamas, you see, they differ from these more modern styles that are being grown for more fiber, and that those working llamas, they shed. Now, there aren't as many working llamas in Canada as we would prefer. So there are some crosses, so you may see partially shedding ones as well. And so there is lots of space for there to be confusion with people who haven't encountered alpacas or llamas before, and they're not 100% certain which is which. I've got some pictures here though to kind of illustrate that point. So you'll see on the top row, we have some llamas. So you can see from their faces, They have bald faces. They don't have a lot of fiber coverage in and around their noses. You can also see those long banana ears, and also really wide protruding eyes. And they have kind of a broader muzzle. And you can see this fellow on the left. You probably can't see my cursor. The guy who is sniffing a little baby, he's actually a working llama. That's his coat type, so he does shed, but you can see how he actually hasn't got a lot of fiber on his neck. That's because he's a short coat, and so we brush him out every year, just like you would a dog when they go to blow their coats. Now on the bottom, we've got two pictures of alpacas. So we've got two different head styles, and that's also sometimes where we get a bit of confusion. So on the left-hand side, we've got a fellow there with a very full, very fluffy face. This is an adult animal, and he is in full fiber. And you can see also from his head style, he's got more of a wedge shape. Obviously, his eyes aren't protruding, and he's got ears that are small and spear-shaped. And then on the right, we have a female who has been shorn. So you can see she doesn't have a whole bunch of fluff on her, but you can see through the shear marks on her cheeks that her fiber actually extends a little bit further onto her cheeks, even though she doesn't have a really, a very full face like her cohort on the left. And then we got a couple more pictures here, just showing the difference in structures. So we've got some of these llamas here. Again, these are, this pair is a set of longer fibered working llamas, so they do shed. These guys, this is later in the season, but you can see from that set of pictures, we got some longer, straighter top lines, also a higher tail set. And then we've got this animal on the right. This is an alpaca, obviously. Again, kind of a slightly rounded top line and a lower tail set, and that fuller face with kind of that shorter nose style. So, and of course, we can't talk about llamas and alpacas without talking about common misconceptions, because there's a lot of kind of mythology around it. So some of the most common things that I tend to hear, and I think a lot of alpaca owners tend to hear, are that alpacas don't need to be shorn every year, or that llamas don't even need to be shorn. It is a necessity to be able to shear these guys. Alpacas don't shed, and the most common cause of death in the summer, when it isn't misadventure, is heat stroke. So that is a really significant consideration. They handle the cold a lot better than they handle the heat, and so being able to shear them is really important. Llamas, again, some types don't need to be shorn. They shed and can be rushed out. If your animal is not shedding, they do need to be shorn. They may not need a full shearing like an alpaca does. There are different styles of shearing, but if you talk to a shearer who is kind of knowledgeable in these guys, or you talk with a llama breeder, they can kind of give you some pointers. Another common one we hear is alpacas spit at people. That is partially true, and definitely for some of them they do. Like any other individual, they all have personalities, but spitting is their only defense mechanism. They don't have fangs, they don't have hooves. They aren't something that is going to really be able to pick a fight and really win when it comes to a predator, and so they try to gross you out. They spit, and when they're spitting, they're actually bringing up the contents of the rumen, and it smells awful. And the intent is most of the time to encourage other alpacas to get out of their space, but it's also to try and kind of deter things from being around them. So, and again, the idea that alpacas are mean, again, they're individuals. Some like people, some don't. Generally speaking, because alpacas were domesticated for fiber and not as companions to be used for packing, alpacas are more standoffish. Like if you want an animal who's going to be super friendly or who's going to, be more people-oriented, llamas are probably a better fit. There are definitely alpacas out there that do like people and do enjoy engaging with them. But that is the exception. It's not the norm. Again, and we'll probably get into this a little, well, we will get into this a little bit more later on. about also where there's delineations in terms of like alpacas being friendly and then too friendly. There's also this idea, and has become really popular on social media in recent years, that alpacas make great house pets. I'm sure some of you have seen the videos of a couple of the animals around the world, especially in like Australia, who are living in houses. There are welfare concerns around that kind of stuff. Alpacas are a highly social species, and when they're housed in isolation, that does increase the risk of health issues, behavioral disorders, and having run-ins with their people. There is also, really a common question we get asked is, can we provide a guard animal, using an alpaca or using a llama? They are adequate guard animals in certain countries. North America, they are not the best guard animals. So where we run into these issues is there have been studies done in terms of llamas and alpacas being used for guards. Those studies came from the UK and Australia, where they don't have as many large predators to worry about as we do here in North America. And so while there are some situations where alpacas can make an appropriate guard, a lot of the time they are too small to handle large predators like wolves. They're as at risk of being attacked as their charges in those cases. And so there's mixed evidence for it in North America. There's also, common misconception that alpaca fiber is worth nothing. People, end up with a lot of fiber. They aren't sure what to do with it. One of the really cool things about these animals is all of their fiber, when it's healthy, has value, and it increases in value with additional processing. So the more things you can come up with to do, the more you have options for it. And that's one of the really nice things with these guys, is you can be as creative as you want, and there is a market for it. So getting into history. So alpacas and llamas were domesticated between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago in South America, in particular in and around the Andes. So they were one of the large livestock species available to them as they were domesticated. They didn't have any large draft animals, like they didn't have horses that they could work with. And so there was a lot of value in domesticating species that could help them expand the Incan Empire. And that's where llamas and alpacas really fell in. So when it comes to llamas, they're really appreciated for a bunch of traits. And I mean, they're a really nimble animal because they don't have hoofs. They're really great in mountainous terrain. They also walk at the same pace as people do, which is really convenient if you have to walk long distances when you don't have traditional roads. And these guys are really well adapted to high altitude areas and arid conditions, and so they thrived. Both llamas and alpacas have really significant cultural value to the Incans and to the modern Quechua as well. And so, they have also played a really important role in that culture for literally thousands of years now. We see that there have been alpacas mummified in graves and preserved alongside people. So we know that there has been a continuance of that value. That being said, there was a decline in the population after the arrival of the Spanish. The estimates are between 90 to 98% of the population actually ended up passing away. They ended up losing that population after the Spanish arrival. When the Spanish came, they brought in sheep, they brought in their own livestock, and those livestock had communicable diseases, and llamas and alpacas hadn't been exposed to them before. The animals that did survive were the ones that were brought high into the mountains, into the Andes, and the modern descendants we have now come from those populations. Now, in terms of when alpacas first came into Canada, the first ones were imported in the 80s. The CLAA, as we know it, was also brought into effect in the late 80s and 89. But that first large import of animals, there's about 300 and some animals that initially came from South America in 92. So prior to that, any animals that had been in Canada were in zoos. So from there, the registry kind of formalized and including both llamas and alpacas. Prior to that, it had just had llamas. And it recognized a couple of others. I think it recognized guanacos and vicuña as well. Again, these were animals that were located in zoos. So in 96 is when they incorporated to include everything, and when it started really picking up as a national herd book. Now, there have been a couple of imports since then from that initial batch in the 80s. From there, the first group of animals initially, I believe, landed in Nisku. And from there, a group was sent out east to Quebec, and a large group stayed out this way. The registry closed in 2000, so they no longer accepted foundation animals, but I mean, it has continued to grow from there. And we do see animals coming back and forth, being brought in from, say, like the American registry now, because they also have a thriving population down south too. And, you know, all of these animals are now descendant from foundation stock. We are not seeing any more animals being imported from South America. So, yeah, I guess if we are looking at why we are raising alpacas and how we do it, this is where we move on to that portion. You'll forgive me, it's a little bit dry in here. So we're going to start off with the 5 F's when we're thinking about husbandry. I think this really applies to any animals, but this is something that is particularly near and dear to my heart. We want to make sure that we are raising our animals in as good of environments as possible. I mean, the better they do, the better they produce for us. So we always like to think of the 5 F's. So we want to make sure that there is freedom from hunger and thirst. You know, the animals shouldn't have to be starving and digging around for food that they can't access. It's winter, they should have access to water. We shouldn't have to worry about them having to break ice. Alpacas in particular are not very good at breaking ice. And so we want to make sure that those needs are being met. We want to make sure there's freedom from discomfort. You know, we shouldn't have to have animals that are stressed, and these guys are a little bit prone to stress. So, you know, freedom from that discomfort, fear, or freedom from fear and distress. So there shouldn't be a lot of bullying in the pens, a lot of terrorizing going on in external factors. We want to make sure, obviously, that our animals are healthy. So there should be freedom from pain, from injury, from disease. There are a lot of vets around. Many of them will see alpacas. So having those connections is really valuable. And of course, we want to make sure there is freedom for them to be able to just be themselves. When these animals are themselves, they thrive. And that's one of the things that is really endearing about them. For anyone who is concerned about, you know, who supports these kinds of these basics, right now, because alpacas are a smaller livestock in Canada, there isn't as much access to like RSPCA kind of resources with them, like you might see with more traditional livestock. And so right now, when it comes to managing or encouraging people to do the best by their animals, that's being largely self-policed by our associations. Those associations are advocating to try and encourage like humane societies and stuff to follow the basic tenets to make sure that these animals' needs are being met. But unfortunately, that is a long time coming. And with it being a smaller livestock, you know, just like a lot of other non-traditional livestock, it can be a little bit hard getting that traction. So if you are ever wanting to ensure that you're connecting with a group that can help you, kind of, maybe you come across an animal who looks like it is in distress or something like that, reaching out to the associations is a good place to start. So if we're planning where we're going to put our animals, we want to be mindful of housing and stocking rates. Alpacas can be housed. They're pretty versatile. They can be housed on pasture. They can be housed on dry lot. They do come from a really arid environment, and so dry lot doesn't bother them. In terms of pasture, the better the pasture, the better. But they can also tolerate some pretty substandard pastures, and that's fine so long as they're being supplemented appropriately. Generally speaking, the average stocking rate we're aiming for is 2 to 5 animals per acre. If that is on moderate pasture, you can get about double that if it's on dry lot. But again, we want to be mindful of being able to give them enough space to naturally do their thing, and also being able to keep that place clean enough to prevent any issues like parasites down the road. So within that, when we're stocking, we also need to be mindful that you can't just like stick them all in a pen and they will be fine. If they're the same sex, yes. But alpacas are induced ovulators, which means they can be bred year round. And so because of that, it is highly inadvisable to house males with females unless you're intending on them being bred and you're planning on removing that male after the job has been done. Alpacas breed in a little bit of a different way than other livestock do. You know, anyone who's been around horses, cows, that kind of stuff, right? The male mounts, hops off. Once he's done, it's in and out nice and quick, relatively quick. Because alpacas are induced ovulators, they actually require a little bit more stimulation than other livestock do. So they actually breed laying down with a male mounted, and because the female doesn't ovulate without that male actually mounting, the male is traumatizing the female's uterus while he is breeding to actually make sure that enough lining is being shed so that an egg can implant. Breeding can last a minimum of 15 minutes. And so during that time, we do worry about overbreeding because it does actually cause damage to the female if she is then exposed to that male breeding her over and over and over and over again. And that can result in stress. That can cause ulcers in the female. That can also result in stress on the male. I mean, if he's got unfettered access and he is just going at it, he is not eating. He's not going to be doing all the other things he needs to do to keep his body going. If there are babies involved, he may be mounting those babies. They don't care. They will just help themselves. So we do have to be really mindful of that. Gelded males, you know, some people will house gelded males with females. Again, best practice, it's not highly recommended. If the male has gotten to a point of breeding at any point, he now has the learned behavior. And even if he's gelded, he may still be engaging in that act, just not as visibly. He may be breeding them at night. They like breeding at night when they're in pasture conditions. It's cooler, more comfortable for them. I think they like the privacy. I don't know. But generally speaking, it's just best practice not to house the males with the females. So that being said, within male groups, we do try to recreate what we call bachelor herd conditions when we keep our male groups. We want males to be of a similar size. With, you know, we don't put the weanling babies in with the big boys and expect there not to be some issues with, you know, the pecking orders, because there is such a big size disparity. But we may also sometimes find that there is the odd male who he doesn't get along with anyone, in which case sometimes you may need to consider housing them individually. That doesn't happen very often. And sometimes it only needs to be done during breeding season. But having enough pens where you can do that is something to keep in mind when you're designing your pasture setup. And of course, we want to make sure when we're developing that pasture setup that we have adequate shelter. So, you know, alpacas will tolerate a lot of conditions. They handle those weather conditions pretty well. They especially handle the cold, like unless it is ridiculously cold with a lot of snow and a lot of wind, you're probably not going to find them actually using their sheds most of the time if they have access to food. You'll see some of them will probably go into their sheds at night to sleep for a little bit and then they'll be back out again. So a lot of people get sometimes worried and contact us when they've got alpacas, is like they're not using their shed. They will when the weather's bad. They are more inclined to use their sheds after they've been shorn. Again, if it's raining, if it's windy, they're now naked. They are totally going to use that shelter. So making sure that shelter has enough airflow so that it's not going to be stuffy, not going to be a risk for pneumonia. And also making sure there's enough room for animals to hang out. Alpacas do have a personal bubble that's when that spitting kind of comes in. If they are in each other's personal bubble, there's a lot more spit flying. So making sure they have enough space so that they can kind of lay comfortably, hang out with their buddies if they want to. That's ideal. So yeah, three-sided shelters, horse shelters, calf shelters, oftentimes are more than enough to do the job. If people have access to better resources and can offer a barn or heated barn, the animals love it. They do great there. But making sure that there is just access to something that's going to break the wind, get them out of the sun, especially during the hot summers. That's really important. Now, when it comes to fencing, we're actually more concerned about keeping things out than alpacas in. Alpacas don't really challenge fences in the same way. So, we want to make sure that that fence is predator proof. It's really common for people to use things like no climb meshes, sometimes rails, because narrow enough they're not going to climb through. Rail and mesh is also popular for some places. We do advise against using barbed wire. These are a fiber animal, which means entanglement in barbed wire is a high risk. I know there have been times like when I've been shearing other people's animals, we have discovered animals that have had small lengths of barbed wire actually embedded in place if they've had multiple years worth of fiber on them. And that's not a fun thing to come across, and it's also not a comfortable thing for those animals to be living with. Electric fencing can work if the animals are shorn. Electric fencing does not work very well once they have fiber on them and they can no longer feel it. So again, there are pros and cons. A lot of people choose to use electric fencing, again, for predator deterrence. They'll put a hot wire on the ground or on the mid-level to deter things from sticking their noses where they don't need to be. So other considerations for making sure we're predator proofing is making sure the fences are at an adequate height, or at least external fences are an adequate height. Something's not going to be easily climbed over. That the fences are not going to be something that's going to be dug under, and that the weakest part in many pastures is gates. So we want to make sure the gates are secure. Alpacas are also really wickedly nimble with their lips. Their lips are semi-prehensile. Having gates that they cannot open themselves is a benefit. So sometimes attaching clips to the gates for when it comes to like little bits of chain, because you will sometimes get animals who have too much time on their hands and will 100% fiddle with those gates and then open them, and now you have animals visiting your neighbors. We'd like to avoid that too. So I guess moving on to feed and nutrition. So alpacas are a pseudo-ruminant. They're not a true ruminant. They do chew their cud, but because of how they're designed, they are really better suited to a higher protein, a lower sugar diet that is also lower in fats. I've heard them compared to kind of being more similar to cats in their the diets that they do well on. So what we're wanting to see there is probably not something that's going to be super high in grains. You're definitely not going to be putting in a whole lot of additives like oils that can really disrupt the rumen. And so for alpacas, they handle forages far better than they handle concentrates. And of course, with alpacas being a fiber animal, we're also wanting to maximize their production potential, right? If we're using these animals to produce fiber for us, we want to make sure that we're being mindful of the diet that we're giving them so that they have enough energy to grow that fiber and also not lose body condition themselves. So we are usually sometimes looking at different nutritional needs depending on what they're producing. So animals who are using, like who we are using for fiber production, animals who are pregnant or lactating, males who are breeding during the year, and of course growing young stock. Those guys are going to need a lot more in terms of nutrition than say your castrated, your gelded boys, your pasture pets who are just there for companionship, who, you don't need them to be putting out a ton of fiber. They're not being bred. They're not having these extra demands. They're just getting to kind of hang out and be your buddies. And of course, non-breeding animals, they're not growing anything. They're not growing a fetus. so they don't need the extra nutrition. So they're usually fine on more marginal feeds. So we want to make sure that they're not like lacking in anything, especially in terms of nutrients and vitamins. But they're not needing a high performance diet, for lack of a better term. So again, going back to they do better on forages than they do on concentrates. The diets we recommend typically being between 70 to 90% based in forages. So that may include grasses, hays, beet pulp. Those guys all work well. We want to see them primarily getting that. And so within that kind of sphere, alpacas, when you look at like their mouth anatomy, they do have they've got teeth on the bottom jaw, and they've also got a palate, like a dental pad up top. So very similar to cows, very similar to, I think, goats, where, they are cropping those grasses off, but because alpacas are also, they kind of have really a smaller jaw structure, they are going to far prefer being able to eat leafy forages and grass hays to really coarse hays, like stuff with really mature alfalfa. They're going to pick through those stems. They're not going to eat those stems. That will end up costing you a lot in hay that just becomes bedding. So, if you have the chance to get your hands on like early cut hay or alfalfa while the flower is still in the boot, those mixes, you're probably going to have a much better uptake from the animals with a lot less waste. And they're going to enjoy it more. From a fiber perspective, like when we're looking at hays that have a lot of seed heads in it, that can be difficult for production in that those seed heads are going to get embedded in the fiber. And now for you as the farmer, when you're going to clean those fleeces to send off for processing, you're now having to pick out tons and tons of bits of timothy, or that timothy is going to end up in your yarn. Because even the best mills, they can only get so much vegetable matter out. And a big part of making sure you're getting a nice end product is making sure you're doing a really good job prepping it to send to those mills. So, those are just some considerations when it comes to dealing with like picking your hay. Thankfully, alpacas don't eat a ton. Generally, you can safely estimate that an alpaca is going to go through maybe 1,000-pound bale a year, or an average of 2 square bales a month. Alpacas are going to only be eating, 1 to 2.5% of its body weight in hay or in forages daily. And so, for a 100-pound animal, they're only going to be taking in about 1 pound a day. So you can really get some longevity there. And that does help in the long run. If you are offering concentrates, it should be a minor part of the diet. Most people choose to use the concentrates for making sure alpacas are getting enough of their nutrients. Alpacas do have a really high need for vitamin D. Coming from South America, coming from really high in the Altiplano, they are designed to absorb sunlight to get their vitamin D. So you'll see, a lot of alpacas after they've been shorn, they spend a lot of time sunbathing, and a lot of times they're trying to expose those areas like the low fiber areas, like the underbelly, the inner legs and stuff, for the sun to get that sunlight so that they can synthesize vitamin D. We're in Canada. We do not have nearly enough sunlight to give them those needs, so we do need to supplement. A lot of feeds do have extra vitamin D in it. Those feeds also oftentimes have extra zinc, extra selenium, extra vitamin E, a certain amount of copper, just to make sure that you're getting enough. So, that's where we would be using a ration primarily, for people who are maybe wanting to add something extra, or maybe they want to be giving something to their animals in the cold weather, or they've got some hard keepers. Soaked beet pulp can be really beneficial there. The alpacas, they process the beet pulp like they would a forage, and it's really great for getting weight onto some of those hard keepers without also giving them a ton of sugar. So in terms of individual minerals, loose minerals are really popular. They are preferred over lick blocks because alpacas don't do a lot of licking. They will do a little bit of licking sometimes, but that's not a guarantee. So loose mineral that is in powder form is really popular for them. You can also, in Alberta in particular, you can get access to molassified chew blocks. These kind of crumble when the animals drag their teeth across them. They will chew those as well. But if you're going to be using any sort of mineral, any sort of blocks, making sure that it is a camelid specific formulation is really important, just to make sure they're getting that right balance. So moving from housing and feed towards, how we take care of these animals. We're going to be looking at basically what can we do with them, handling them. These guys are small. You don't need to use you don't need fancy handling equipment for them like you would cattle to get the most out of it. Most of these guys can get by with using a catch pen. Alpacas are really smart. You can train them like a dog. They learn their names. They can do tricks. They are very food motivated. If you use treats, you can usually get them doing all sorts of really interesting things. So they're really easy to train just in general. A lot of people, when it comes to halter training, trailer training, it doesn't take very long. They also learn routines extremely well, which can make handling so much easier on your daily routines. They will learn what time it is to come in, and they will wait at the gate to come in. They will learn what feeding time is, and they will let you know. So when it comes to, again, thinking about those pen setups, we do want to make sure that handling areas do account for that because they are touch averse. Alpacas don't groom each other. They don't even lick their own babies off when the babies are born, which means they don't really like being touched. And so when it comes to catching them, having a way to catch them is you're not going to have a lot of luck going out into the field and like grabbing them and haltering them like you could a horse or a really friendly horse. Having catch pens is really important. So having areas that maybe you designate for feeding, so they build those habits. Sometimes you can make your life a lot easier when it comes to catching them by doing that and being able to regularly catch them for things like, herd health, being able to catch them for the vet, for shearing. All of those things are really important and should be kind of considered when setting up your pasture. Sometimes even having just like a couple of high hog panels will get the job done. So, Sharon, I see you raised your hand.
Oh, just to make sure that we get to the halfway point since we're about just a little bit past our halfway
Okay.
time.
Thank you. I will talk faster.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Just one last thing in terms of handling best practices. If you're getting an alpaca halter, it is sometimes hard to track down alpaca halters. Halters should be well fitting, so they should actually sit really high in the nasal cavity because they're obligate nose breathers. And so loose halters will cause the animals to freak out. If it in any way obstructs their ability to breathe, you will have an animal who is losing their mind. So you can save yourself the stress. There's lots of places online you can pick up halters that are specific for alpacas and that also adjust so you can make sure it fits your animal best. I do want to touch on berserk male syndrome. This is something that will come up if you spend any time in and around alpaca circles. It's also known as aberrant behavior syndrome or novice handler syndrome. This is characterized by the alpacas becoming dangerous. So it's seen in both male and females. And it's something where, sometimes people think, oh, these animals are just being mean or they're just being funny. A lot of times it's because the animal's been poorly socialized. This is oftentimes where we see animals treating people as if they were fellow llamas and alpacas. And it starts off when they're young. It becomes a significant risk as they get older because they get bigger. And it doesn't take much for one of these animals to knock over a child, to knock over an adult. And it may include things like them grabbing you by your legs and trying to take your legs out from under you. So, this is something to watch out for. There is a certain amount of play fighting behaviors that are normal to see in alpacas. Males in particular, they play wrestle. We call it neck wrestling, leg wrestling, where they are practicing the things they need to do to be functional, the big boys when they grow up. This usually hits around puberty. You'll see an increase in this wrestling, and then they kind of sort it out as they get older. Some males, however, may continue to do this as they age, just here and there to maintain pecking order. If you're seeing that there's a big size disparity in your males and someone's getting hurt, those fights absolutely need to be broken up though, just like in any other livestock. You don't want animals getting hurt or animals being forced away from resources like feeding areas, watering areas, shelters. That's something to be just mindful of when you're keeping an eye on your herd. Again, more on berserk male syndrome. There are certain conditions that seem to be to make it more likely to take place. Animals that are raised in isolation, especially younger animals, if they need to be around other llamas and alpacas to know how to become llamas and alpacas and to know the difference between llamas, alpacas, and people. When they are raised in isolation, they are more likely to show inappropriate boundaries with people. And we do see this, unfortunately, more often in bottle raised animals, especially if it's wintertime and people raise them in the house and they don't raise them with other animals. That's something that can be an issue as well. Sometimes in petting zoos, they can become over handled when they're too young. Now, they can be used for petting zoos. You just want to make sure you're not exposing them to that kind of stuff at the wrong developmental periods. So yeah, in terms of reducing risk, we want to make sure that we are housing them with animals of their own species so they can learn how to be animals in their own species using older animals. So you're looking at yearlings, 2-year-olds, and older for petting zoos. The benefit of that is you also get some extra time to do some desensitization and training to make them safer for the public. Making sure you're maintaining appropriate boundaries. So, that good rule of thumb, if that animal is not going to be so cute when it's 150 pounds, it doesn't need to be doing that behavior when it's 50. And when we're engaging with them, we should be the ones initiating interactions, not them. In terms of health and maintenance, the other side of handling, again, generally speaking, they're pretty low maintenance, but shearing is an annual requirement, and it is generally recommended that animals be shorn full body every year. For animals who are maybe underweight or maybe elderly and they don't grow enough fiber each year to make it through the winter, you can talk with your shearer about modified cuts that help them get adequate ventilation, but also give them enough protection to get through the winter without having any issues. Alpacas will grow less and less fleece as they get into older and older years, but that also varies by animal. Not every elderly animal has that issue. There are many that do still need to be shorn each year. To be shorn safely, alpacas do need to be temporarily restrained. That can be done in a number of ways. Many shearers will shear them on a tilt table or on mats on the ground. Sometimes they can shear them with a chute, but yeah, they can't be like sat on their butts like a sheep. So they do need to be restrained, and part of that restraint is being able to catch them. So a lot of people do use shearing time to also kind of do other health stuff, checking teeth, trimming toenails, that kind of stuff. The best time of year to book a shearer is this time of year. Shearers oftentimes travel, and so getting on the list early means they can travel out to you. The more people you can have on hand for shearing day is also going to be helpful. And, just some things to be prepared for shearing day. Be able to catch them ahead of time, keep them dry. They cannot be shorn wet. They should not be shorn wet. Shearers do not like shearing wet animals. It is unsafe for both the animal and the shearer for them to be wet at shearing time. On top of that, you may find some animals that are going to make themselves wet. They're going to spit all over the place. So just having paper towels on hand, rags, that kind of stuff is really helpful. They're not like sheep where you have to fast them before shearing, but it does help if the animals don't have a full stomach when you go to put them on a table or that kind of stuff, just to keep them comfy. Other regular maintenance, so toenails need to be trimmed as needed. So checking them monthly is really beneficial. They do not have hooves, but they do have toe pads, and they have 2 nails per foot. And those nails can be trimmed kind of like dog nails. You can use, goat or sheep hoof trimmers, garden prunes, that kind of stuff. Generally speaking, alpacas should be vaccinated. Standard 8 weight is pretty much all that's required. We're pretty lucky out west here. We don't have to worry about things like M-worm. So we don't have to do monthly ivermectin injections to prevent that. But making sure they're getting vitamin D when they need it. Vitamin D can either be given orally, in which case that's, usually more frequently than injections. But they can also, if you're comfortable with needles, be given, the vitamin D via shot. And then you want to make sure you're checking them regularly just to make sure that you can monitor their parasite levels. Most of the time, these guys are pretty good for parasites, but it is the most likely thing that is going to knock their health down. If an animal is being ill thrifty, 9 times out of 10, there is some sort of parasite load going on there. So, yeah, the most common ailments that we are going to be seeing: gastrointestinal parasites, stomach ulcers, bad teeth, bad nutrition can all cause weight loss. External parasites, zinc deficiency in particular, or stress, can cause fiber loss. Alpacas do tend to get a lot of sebaceous cysts as they get older, so lumps and bumps are pretty normal. When you see it like in and around their backs and stuff, you'll see it at shearing time. They can be drained, but you want to be really careful checking them for also abscesses. Their fiber can hide a lot, and so lumps and bumps aren't always cysts. If it's seeming like it's bigger than normal, there's always a good chance that it could be an abscess, and that's an issue. General ill thrift, we might be seeing things like anemia, again, ulcers, temperature variants that are causing issues, vitamin deficiencies, injuries. And of course, the most common gastrointestinal, a lot of alpacas experience choke. They'll just eat too much feed at once, and they then vomit it everywhere, and they seem to be really struggling. That's just because they've just now swallowed a whole whack of food, and they can't swallow it all in one go. But bloat and torsions are also not uncommon. So other considerations when it comes to housing, alpacas and llamas, they can totally be housed with other species, but because they are not a hoofed animal, and because they do come from an environment where they did not really co-evolve with these other animals, they are more susceptible to some things that our traditional livestock are pretty hardy to. So for example, parasites. Alpacas don't tolerate parasite loads nearly as well as sheep and goats do. And they do unfortunately share parasites between them. However, they do not share parasites with horses. So it's not uncommon to use those guys to rotate pastures and to help them clean up after each other. But alpacas are also, they're touch averse, which means they're more likely to be pushed away from food. So you want to make sure you're housing them in a way that they can access food. Make sure that they have no access to medicated feeds, because they are sensitive to medicated feeds, just like horses. And they also, they're not hoofed, which means they're not designed to be able to tolerate big forces like getting kicked by other hoofed animals. And so they are prone to injury there too. Now, in terms of why we raise them, we do raise them for fiber. Traditionally speaking, they are raised specifically for textiles. A lot of people also will raise them for breeding stock, pets. They've been popular for public relations for a long time, as well as education. Some places still use them for meat. Some places incorporate meat into their business model. And then in certain areas, especially like the UK, Australia, you see them used as livestock guardians. Increasingly, we are seeing more alpacas being used for agritourism, which is really exciting. We're seeing a lot more being used for marketing and public relations. And we're also finding that they're really beneficial and really actually work well in animal-assisted activities, including in therapeutic settings. So when it comes to picking your first animals, it helps to, for one, have that picture as to what a healthy animal looks like. So you want to do the traditional things, right? You're looking for clear eyes, no discharge, no sign of ill thrift. You may want to feel their backs, make sure that they feel healthy. being able to take a look at their conformation. Do they have crooked legs? Is that going to be something that's going to be posing a risk for arthritis down the road? You don't want to see signs that the animal has been neglected. It can walk soundly. And ideally, if you can handle the animal yourself and see that it's going to be a good fit for you behaviorally, that's fantastic. If you can do that, that makes life a lot easier too. It gives you a better sense to be able to put hands on the animals just to see if it's the right fit for you. Again, when it comes to picking your animals, it never hurts to visit as many farms as possible. It doesn't hurt to ask a lot of questions. Good farmers are good alpaca farmers, we love talking about alpacas. We will answer your questions. We love talking about people sharing that interest in these animals. And so if they're willing to answer your questions and they're transparent in it, that's a great sign. It's also totally okay to ask for references, especially if you're buying breeding stock and you are investing a bunch of money in these guys. Ask for references from vets. Ask for information about farms who regularly know and work with these people. And it's okay to insist on getting a sales contract, as well as a written guarantee in terms of whatever pieces have been discussed during the process of developing that sale. Again, things to consider for picking your animals, knowing what you're aiming for, right? Are you wanting to raise these for fiber? Are you wanting to be able to do PR or marketing with them or agritourism? Visiting a couple of farms, visiting a lot of farms, visiting alpaca events and seeing how other people are doing it can sometimes give you a nice flavor for what does and doesn't work, gives you a lot of chances to talk to other people and their experiences. And there's a lot of ways that you can then gather information too about these animals to pick out ways to kind of fine tune your preferences, right? If you are breeding for fiber or wanting to breed for fiber, you might want to look into histogram testing for fiber testing, seeing what those fleeces have scored as when they've been classed by fiber classers. You might want to attend some shows if you're looking at producing breeding stock to see what is good conformation, what is bad conformation, what colors do you like? They come in 22 different colors and so many patterns. There's a lot of ways to get exposed to these guys to kind of decide what you like and what you don't like. I do want to touch on registration a little bit. Registration for alpacas in Canada does apply to both breeding and non-breeding animals. It's just intended to track the national herd so that we can be able to get them recognized as livestock and take advantages of all the benefits of them being a livestock in a country. The nice thing with registration is it is DNA validated.
Now what have you hit?
Whoop. Hello?
I think maybe it was just an accidental comment. You can carry on.
No worries. So yeah, parents are DNA validated. So one of the things, like I said before, alpacas will sometimes breed in the dark and sometimes accidents happen and you think you bred one animal to one animal, even if it's hand breeding, and then you get the DNA back and you find out that actually the father is not the father. So DNA is the most reliable way to be able to confirm parentage. Our national registry also has an initiative in terms of reducing congenital defects. There is a focus on that within the standards. So there are some benefits in terms of picking a registered versus an unregistered animal. You can get registered animals oftentimes for the same prices as pets as what you are seeing unregistered animals going for, and you're getting some extra opportunities in place with that piece of paper. Registered animals also are microchipped. So there is now a way to identify the identity of the animal and to track its ownership if the animal is ever lost or stolen. Now, that being said, there are pros and cons. If you're choosing to register animals yourself, there's a little bit of an added cost in terms of that. If you're registering an already registered animal, you're looking at about $50 total to have the DNA done, to have the paper done up. But once it's there, it's there. So in the end, at the end of the day, it's, for what you're getting, that animal can then, its offspring are more valuable if you're selling breeding stock. And you also have some of these added benefits of, if the animal is lost or stolen, it can be traced back to you. If the animal is recovered, right? And you can take advantage of all the other benefits of tracking lineages, reducing congenital defects, that kind of thing. When it comes to buying animals, there has been an increase, like a ridiculous increase in online scams. So keep an eye out for that kind of stuff. There are warning signs. I've got them listed here. I'm not going to get into super detail about them because they're pretty standard across the board. My understanding is you guys have access to a handout package. So yeah, just keep your eye out for scams and for high pressure situations because oftentimes, especially online, they're looking to just get money from you. They don't have animals to sell you. Common problems we see: animals being hard to catch. They don't want to be handled. You get out of them what you get or put into them. So if you don't have a catch area to catch them regularly, they're going to be harder to catch than if you are putting your hands on them regularly. The more you handle them, the more desensitized they are, the easier they are to engage with on a day-to-day basis. And like I said, they're smart like dogs. It doesn't take a ton of regular handling after you've done that initial bit. But if you're handling them a couple of times a month, oftentimes that is more than enough to get the job done. Alpacas spitting at people, oftentimes they're being stressed out, or sometimes it's a personality thing. But again, handling them, learning how to handle them without stressing them out can be really beneficial. Other things we sometimes see, alpacas will sometimes, in guard situations, like with sheep and goats, will mount other animals because they're smaller and they oftentimes are intact males. The way around this is do not use intact males as a guardian animal, and they will not mount your sheep or goats. Being able to identify when to trim nails, again, regular handling, keeping an eye on nail lengths is really helpful. We've already talked about, shearing is an annual thing. We aim for that in the spring. If you're having issues with, figuring out what to do with fiber, there are options within the communities you can reach out. So, and of course, knowing how to handle temperatures is another one. Shearing is really important. Having adequate shelter is really important for managing the cold. So some communities that you can access, I've already mentioned the CLAA. They are the national registry. So they handle only registration and the genetic improvement initiatives. Alpaca Canada, that is the association that is a subdivision of the CLAA, and it is there for education, for networking. It also maintains a list of resources. So that includes member farms, shearers in particular, mills, sorters, that kind of thing. And then at a regional level, we have the provincial clubs. Alberta's provincial club is Alpaca. If you're in Saskatchewan, you're looking at the Saskatchewan Alpaca Breeders Network. The Alpaca Association in British Columbia is in BC. We got the Manitoba Alpaca Club in Manitoba, Alpaca Ontario, obviously in Ontario, and then Alpaca Quebec in Quebec. Unfortunately, no clubs yet in the Maritimes. And
That's perfect.
Good. Okay, I have room for questions. If you have
You're
questions.
right on. You're right on time. So that was a great overview and pretty thorough, from shelter to nutrition and handling and ailments, as well as finding the right fit. So if anyone still has questions on any of those topics that she covered, please put them in the chat. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Amber, to ask the questions.
Yeah, so we do have a couple here. You did touch on it, but maybe we worth more to kind of dive into on your opinion on keeping sheep and alpacas in the same pasture slash barn. Yeah, there's two with the same question.
Sure. You know what? And that's a question I get a lot, especially because, like, I'm sure I'll sometimes have people be like, "Oh, well, can you shear, my sheep as well as these guys?" It can be done. Like, don't get me wrong, it can be done, but it takes more work. Alpacas use a communal dung pile, which means when it comes to pasture and parasite management, alpacas do not spread parasites around quite the same way as sheep and goats do. because sheep and goats obviously don't use a communal dung pile. Because they do share parasites, and sheep and goats can tolerate that higher parasite load. The parasite load that will, not bother that sheep or goat is oftentimes significant enough to bother an alpaca. So just being on top of like doing regular fecal checks, treating animals as needed. So both for the sheep, the goats, for the alpacas, those are really important if you're going to be co-housing. As well, alpacas are really susceptible to caseous lymphadenitis. So CL, I believe they are also susceptible to CAE. So of course, in the same way that you would look to mitigate CL and CAE in your sheep or your goat herd, you definitely want to make sure that that herd is negative before introducing an alpaca or a llama, because CL in llamas and alpacas is almost always fatal. It is very difficult to treat successfully. I know of very few animals who've been successfully treated for it. The vast majority have had to be euthanized. So that is something to keep in mind, because sheep can sometimes be pretty big. If you've got animals who are a little bit rammy, alpacas, again, they keep their personal bubble. They aren't touchy, so they're not ramming each other. The males might neck wrestle, that kind of stuff, but they can't handle being, head butted, but with force by a big ram or by an animal who's getting testy. So they may give them a lot of space, which means they may get pushed away from food. So that's something just to be mindful of, is like if you have an animal who's really pushy, the alpacas might end up getting the short end of that stick. Conversely, alpacas tolerate more copper in their diet, and they do need some copper in their diet than sheep do. So having separate concentrates, separate, minerals and that kind of stuff for sheep and alpacas is recommended if you are going to co-house, just because the sheep will not appreciate the extra copper. So, yeah.
That sounded amazing. I do actually have a question for you, but there was one here just asking if there's available like to the Zoom link after, and I just wanted to mention we are recording. We will put this on the YouTube channel and send it all out to you guys, so you can see the package and rewatch the video. And there is a survey in the chat if you guys don't mind filling it out, and there's a place to stay connected with us. But I was actually curious, Peyton, you had mentioned beet pulp. Do you guys have to soak it like you would? Like, I know there's the controversy of like, do you soak or not soak with horses with beet pulp? Do you have to do the same thing with alpacas and llamas?
So the reason why you'd spend like the most common reason why you'd probably soak beet pulp is because most of the beet pulp we can get through our feed stores is pelleted. Beet pulp is a really nice way to get extra moisture into their diets, especially in the winter. And so soaking can have that dual effect of, they're getting extra nutrition, extra volume because they're getting that extra moisture. But if you're feeding just beet shreds, and it's in that non-pelleted form, they will totally eat those dry. They're fine with that. That doesn't bother them at all. I know sometimes the question comes up around sugar, because obviously these beet pulp is from leftover sugar beets. Most of the sugar has been extracted at that point. And so even though alpacas don't tolerate, extra sugars, extra carbohydrates, that kind of stuff quite the same way as other livestock do, it doesn't seem to negatively affect them. And it is like most of the vets, when they're talking about like, your hard keepers, that kind of stuff, beet pulp is what they recommend after increasing your alfalfa intake. So
That's awesome. We have another question. If males and females cannot be housed together, can they be next to each other? Like within sight or?
yeah, absolutely. So long as the males can't get through the fence. And some males are really creative. I have learned over the years that some males, if they have like cage wire that's too wide of a gap, they can get girls through the fence, because the girls, they do want to be bred. So just be mindful, like when you're setting up your fences, like the males can absolutely share a fence with the girls. Just make sure it's a good enough fence that the boys can't climb over, for being over enthusiastic. Some people prefer to keep an aisleway in between, so there's a little bit of physical distance, and some people will prefer to house their females downwind, so that when it comes to I'm trying to remember down, upwind, they oftentimes choose to house the females in a way that the wind does not carry their scent over to the males, just to keep the males from getting too excited. Um, the nice thing about raising males in a bachelor group situation is that when they've done the studies in terms of like aggression in camelids, in particular in wild camelids, so like vicuña and guanacos, they've seen different group types and they've modified or they've monitored those aggression levels, and the studies have found that males who are living just with other males and not with females show the least amount of aggression out of males who are housed with females. The most likely males to be aggressive with other alpacas and with people are males who are housed in that harem situation, where it is a male to a bunch of females. And so there are also those handling benefits. So if you can keep your boys separate, your life will be easier in that way. But they can totally touch noses to the fence. Like that's not an issue.
Awesome. There's another question on would sugar beets work when it comes to feeding alpacas? We were just curious because our dad grows them. I'm thinking they're meaning in its entirety.
I don't know if you would want to feed that to them whole, just because like their mouths aren't super big, so they'll struggle to eat a whole apple. If you offer them slices of an apple, they can manage it. Depending on how big your beets are. If you're going to offer them beets, I would suggest not doing it in moderation if they're the full sugar beet. I've heard that they really like the tops to the beets, like the leafy bits. So I think if you wanted to give them a treat, they would probably really appreciate that treat. But yeah, I would just be careful around making sure it's any whole beets they're getting are something that they can adequately chew so that they can swallow without it becoming lodged. And feeding it in moderation because they are they are somewhat sugar sensitive. It's just that beet pulp, that sugar has been extracted, right?
We have another one is what is a suitable way to handle them so they get some exposure to you, but not too much? Does it mean walking through the pens or something extra, just day-to-day chores?
Both works. Really, the barometer there is if you're initiating the interactions, right? If you're remembering that these guys are touch averse, the only reason interactions are going to be initiated between alpacas are over, resource disputes, or for breeding purposes or for wrestling purposes, right? And so where overhandling becomes an issue is when the animals are allowed the opportunity to interact with you or they initiate a behavior like that. So, the problem behaviors we see is like an animal who's been allowed to, say, grab people's ankles as a baby, right? They think they're initiating a play behavior. And then as an adult or as they're going through puberty, they're now taking that behavior a step further. So if you're the one who's initiating that interaction, so maybe you're wandering through the pens, or maybe you're catching them and you're insisting on having your hands on them before releasing them, right? Or you are actively purposefully training them. Maybe you're doling out treats because they're doing a trick. So long as you're the one initiating those interactions and you're kind of at a comfortable level, it will probably be fine. I know speaking for myself personally, I'm out in the pens daily. When I'm feeding them, I'm running my hands over their back. So most of the herd is being touched on a daily basis, and then touch more on herd health days where, we're taking them and giving them the big once over, right? So then they're getting checked from nose all the way down to their toes. And so really they do handle a good amount of touch, and that doesn't seem to create any issues. You'll have some animals that are less happy about being touched than others. And the only way to get around that is to desensitize them and to touch them more. But yeah, so long as you're initiating that stuff, you should be fine.
That's awesome. Well, that's so for all the questions. So I'll give it another minute for any last, like a last question that anybody wants to throw in the chat there. I did want to mention that if you guys do have any other questions, you can always reach out and I can maybe, if Peyton doesn't mind, send them on over to her. And if you guys don't mind to fill out the survey, we can stay connected that way and get you some information. There's an opportunity to sign up for our newsletter, and I believe Loudoun County also has a newsletter you could be interested in signing up for. And yeah, we thank you very much, Peyton. I I got a lot out of this, so hopefully everybody else did. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. And yeah, to your point about questions, I mean, people absolutely, you're welcome to send them my way. I do have, I think, a resource slide later on with contact links. If people have questions, they can reach out to pretty much any of the associations, any of the clubs too, whoever is in their local area. And you can contact people and it will connect with other breeders who are also happy to answer questions. Like if you got questions around registration, the CLA is great. Alpaca Canada will handle a lot of general stuff, but you can reach out to us at Alpaca at the club, and we are more than happy to again answer any questions too. So
Well, it looks like that was all of the questions and a bunch of thank yous from everybody in the chat to you. So awesome, thank you.
thank you guys for making it out.
And thank you for all who attended and watched. I did see a couple answers that you guys have been to all three of them. So for everybody who's been able to make one or all, thank you for attending. So awesome.